You know that little buzz, that feeling people talk about? The dopamine hit?
Mm-hmm.
Well, today we're kind of taking a hammer to that whole idea. We're going way deeper.
Yeah, it's much more fascinating than just a hit.
Totally. We want to explore the real world of dopamine, how it connects, like our biology, our psychology, these brain circuits. It's actually way cooler than you'd think.
It really is.
We're even going to get into dopamine schedules.
Yeah.
How everyday stuff, food, coffee, even just scrolling social media, how that affects your dopamine and ultimately how satisfied you feel.
Exactly. Our mission today is to really unpack that, give you a solid understanding of what's driving you, maybe even some practical tools.
Okay, let's do it.
So this deep dive, we're going to peel back the layers, look at the biology, what dopamine is,
Right.
how it works in the brain, its role in motivation, pleasure, and importantly, all the different things that can mess with its levels.
And we've got sources that dig into the science, right? Pathways, different kinds of dopamine release.
We do. Neural pathways, the types of release, the impact of various substances, activities. We've even got some personal stories and research findings to share.
And hey, even if you don't have a science degree, right, we'll make it clear.
Absolutely. Define terms as we go.
Because this stuff, it's not just abstract science. It matters for everyday life, how you feel, what gets you moving, your desires.
It's fundamental.
Okay, so let's start with that dopamine hit idea. What's wrong with it? What is dopamine really doing?
Well, the first big thing, like you said, is that hit idea is just too simple. Dopamine isn't just an on-off switch.
Yeah.
It operates with a constant baseline level. Think of it as a background hum that's called tonic release.
Tonic, like a steady state.
Exactly. And then on top of that baseline, you get these temporary increases, phasic releases. Those are the peaks we often think about with rewards.
So it's not just the spikes, it's the hum and the spikes. How do they, interact? How does that affect how we feel?
Right. That interaction is crucial. How big a peak feels depends entirely on where your baseline is. A small peak, when your baseline is already high, might not feel like much. But that same peak, if your baseline is low, that can feel significant.
Okay, that makes sense. It's relative.
It's relative. And interestingly, sustained high levels of what we call volumetric release we'll get to that can actually raise the baseline itself.
Which could make the peaks feel smaller.
Potentially, yes.
Okay.
It lessens the relative impact.
Okay, wow. More dynamic than I thought. Now, you mentioned dopamine is a neuromodulator, not just a neurotransmitter. Wait, can we break that down? What's the difference? Why does that matter?
Good question. So think of neurotransmitters as having a very local chat, like two neurons talking directly across a tiny gap, synapse. Very targeted message.
Okay, like a direct message, yeah.
Dopamine as a neuromodulator is more like changing the overall mood of the room.
Yeah.
Or maybe conducting an orchestra.
Broader influence.
Much broader. It doesn't just send one specific message. It changes the probability that whole groups of neurons in a region will fire. It tunes the likelihood of activity.
So it's less flipping a single switch, more like adjusting the sensitivity of a whole bunch of switches.
That's a great way to put it. And that's why it can impact so much our energy, our mindset, our feeling of capability. It's adjusting the whole system's readiness.
Right. And the sources connect it to really fundamental stuff. Mood, motivation, desire, effort. How does it plug into those?
It's deeply plugged in. Dopamine is critical for mood, for how motivated we feel, what we desire, and crucially, our willingness to put in the effort to get those things.
So someone who seems really driven versus someone who maybe lacks that spark, dopamine levels could be a big part of that difference.
A very significant part, yes.
Yeah.
Obviously, other factors play a role, but baseline dopamine is a huge determinant of that outward-facing drive, that excitement, that willingness to pursue goals.
Okay, got it. So it's the get-up-and-go molecule in a way. Now, the info mentioned two main pathways, like highways for dopamine in the brain.
That's right. Two key neural circuits. First is the mesocorticolimbic pathway.
Meso.cortico.limbic.
Yeah, sounds complex, but think meso for middle, cortico for cortex, limbic for emotion motivation areas. It starts deep in the brain, in the ventral tegmentum.
Ventral tegmentum, bottom floor, basically.
Basically, yeah. And it goes up to areas like the nucleus accumbens, part of the ventral striatum, and the prefrontal cortex.
And this one is about...
This is the wanting pathway. Motivation, drive, craving. It's heavily involved when you're pursuing a goal, whether that's, a promotion, a relationship, or, unfortunately, an addictive substance.
So this is the one linked heavily to addiction, cocaine, meth, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Those drugs hijack this pathway, causing massive dopamine release. But it's also the pathway that drives healthy ambitions.
Okay. What's the second major pathway?
That's the nigrostriatal pathway. Nigrostriatal.
Negro. Sounds like substantia nigra. Parkinson's.
You got it. It starts in the substantia nigra, another deep brain area, and goes to the dorsal striatum. And its main job, movement.
Initiating movement, making it smooth.
Precisely. And when dopamine-producing cells die off in the substantia nigra, like in Parkinson's disease, you see those characteristic motor problems, tremors, rigidity, trouble starting movements.
Wow. So critical for movement. Does losing dopamine there also affect mood, like in the other pathway?
Yes, absolutely. In conditions like Parkinson's or Lewy body dementia, where you lose dopamine in both pathways, you often see decreased motivation, flattened emotions, depression, alongside the movement issues.
It's really hitting both movement and motivation.
It is. And sometimes treatments that help restore dopamine for movement can also improve mood, which really highlights that connection.
Amazing how one chemical does so much. Oh, okay. How does it actually get released? You mentioned local versus widespread effect.
Right. Two main ways. First is synaptic release.
Yeah.
That's a very local, targeted release right at the synapse, the gap between two neurons. Dopamine crosses the gap, binds to the next neuron, influences its electrical activity.
The direct message again?
Exactly. But then there's volumetric release. Think of this as dopamine being sort of dumped into the general area, not just aimed at one specific neuron.
Like a broadcast announcement instead of a direct text.
Perfect analogy. It can affect many neurons nearby simultaneously, visiting them in dopamine.
So how do these relate back to the baseline and the peaks we talked about?
Well, you can think of synaptic release as contributing more to those rapid phasic peaks in specific circuits, while volumetric release seems to contribute more to setting that overall background tonic level.
And you said high volumetric release can raise the baseline?
It can, which again might mean subsequent peaks don't feel as high relative to that elevated baseline. It all comes down to the change relative to what was happening just before.
The context matters massively. Okay, so when dopamine does act, is it fast, like flipping a light switch, or slower?
Generally, it's slower than many neurotransmitters that use really fast ion channels. Dopamine mostly works through something called G-protein-coupled receptors, GPCRs.
GPCRs, okay, what does that mean in practice?
Think of it like a relay race inside the cell. Dopamine binds to the GPCR on the outside, and that triggers a whole cascade of events inside the cell. One molecule activates another, which activates another.
Chain reaction, not instant.
Not instant. But the interesting thing about GPCRs is that while they're slower to start, they can trigger multiple downstream effects. And those effects can be really long-lasting.
How long-lasting?
They can even influence gene expression, changing which proteins the cell makes, fundamentally altering how it functions and responds to future signals over the long term.
Wow. So dopamine isn't just a quick signal, it can actually change the cell's programming.
Potentially, yes. So to recap, two pathways, two spatial scales of release, local and broad, and effects ranging from relatively slow to potentially very long-lasting, even down to the genetic level. It's complex stuff.
Definitely blows that simple dopamine hit idea out of the water. Now, I remember reading dopamine doesn't work alone. It has a partner.
It often does. A really important partner is glutamate.
Glutamate. That's the main excitatory one, right? Makes neurons fire.
Exactly. And here's the key. Dopamine neurons often co-release glutamate. So when dopamine is released in those motivation or movement pathways, you're often getting a double whammy, the dopamine effect, plus a general excitatory kick from glutamate.
So it's not just directing motivation or movement. It's also kind of amping up the brain's activity level overall.
That's a good way to think about it. It helps explain why dopamine is linked to sympathetic arousal, alertness, readiness, wanting to engage with the outside world. Dopamine pushes us outward, makes us seek things, experience craving.
Okay, so dopamine is the wanting, the pursuit, but maybe not the whole story of the liking or the pleasure itself.
Precisely. It drives the pursuit, the motivation. The actual feeling of pleasure when you get the reward involves other systems too, like opioids. But dopamine is that universal currency of go get it.
Low dopamine state, you feel lethargic, unmotivated. High dopamine, you're excited, driven, maybe even willing to push through fear.
That's the picture. It tracks what your brain thinks is worth pursuing, based on past success or pleasure, however you define that subjectively. And again, how you feel often depends on the change in dopamine compared to your recent past.
Which brings us right back to that idea of history and baseline being so important. It's not just the moment.
Absolutely not. Your experience right now is shaped by where your dopamine has been recently. That's why scrolling social media feels different depending on what you just saw or how long you've been doing it. Understanding this lets you use dopamine-boosting tools smarter, lets you modulate your own system.
It really sounds incredibly powerful. Are there some maybe stark, real-world examples of just how critical dopamine is when things go really wrong?
Sadly, yes. The MPTP story from the 80s is tragic but illuminating. Some people using illicit drugs accidentally took MPTP, a contaminant.
What did it do?
It selectively killed dopamine neurons.
These were often young people who rapidly developed severe, irreversible Parkinson's symptoms. They became essentially frozen, couldn't move, had zero motivation, just locked in. Oh my God, that's terrifying. It just wiped out both movement and drive.
Completely. A devastating illustration of what happens when that system collapses.
Any examples of maybe temporary disruptions, showing the mood link?
I actually had a personal experience with that. Years ago, I got giardia, ended up dehydrated in the ER. They gave me Thorazine, an older antipsychotic.
And Thorazine affects dopamine.
It blocks dopamine receptors.
Yeah.
And within minutes, I just felt this overwhelming wave of sadness, profound depression, crying for no reason, utterly miserable. It was shocking how quickly blocking dopamine tanked my mood.
Wow, just blocking the receptors did that.
It was a stark reminder. Between stories like the MPTP victims and experiences like that, it really hammers home how precious these dopamine circuits are for movement, mood, motivation. You got to respect this system.
Yeah, absolutely. Makes you want to understand how to keep it healthy. So how can we influence these peaks and baselines? We know genetics and past experiences play a role.
Right, baseline has those influences. But specific activities, substances, they cause temporary spikes above baseline. And the size and length of those spikes vary a lot.
Okay, give us some examples, like chocolate.
Chocolate, yeah. Studies suggest maybe a 1.5 times increase over baseline. Moderate.
What about something more intense? Sex.
Sex, including the anticipation, typically around 2 times baseline.
Nicotine. Smoking.
Nicotine, when smoked, about 2.5 times baseline, but it's very quick, short-lived.
Cocaine.
Also around 2.5 times. Similar peak height to nicotine, but different duration and mechanism.
And amphetamine. Things like Adderall or meth.
That's a big jump.
Yeah.
Amphetamine can be up to 10 times baseline dopamine release. Huge increase.
10 times? Wow. What about exercise?
Exercise is interesting. It's much more subjective. If you enjoy the exercise, you might get around a 2 times increase. If you hate it, maybe not so much.
So our mindset, whether we like it, really matters for things like exercise.
Definitely. That mesocortical limbic wanting pathway is involved. If you consciously focus on the positive aspects, appreciate the effort, you can actually boost the dopamine release from it.
But you mentioned being careful with external rewards afterwards, like rewarding yourself for working out.
Yeah, that can be tricky. If you always rely on an external treat after the workout, your brain might start associating the dopamine more with the treat than the workout itself, potentially undermining the intrinsic enjoyment over time.
So some things like cocaine have a universal effect, but others like exercise or studying are more about our personal engagement.
Exactly. Some chemicals force the release, others depend much more on your subjective experience and mindset.
Okay, what about the king of daily stimulants? Caffeine. How does coffee fit in?
Caffeine gives a modest dopamine boost. But the really interesting thing from a study back in 2015 is that regular caffeine use seems to upregulate certain dopamine receptors, specifically D2 and D3 receptors.
Upregulate, meaning it increases the number or sensitivity of them?
Exactly. It makes your brain potentially more sensitive to the dopamine that is released. So caffeine might make your natural dopamine, or dopamine from other sources, work a bit better.
Oh, that could explain the classic coffee and cigarette combo, the caffeine making the nicotine hit feel stronger.
That's a very plausible mechanism, yes. Synergy.
What about those intense pre-workout drinks? They often have caffeine plus other stuff.
That's where you need to be careful. Combining caffeine with other stimulants, especially things that directly boost dopamine or its precursors, can lead to much larger spikes.
And constantly chasing those huge spikes, that's bad for the baseline, right?
It can be. Frequent excessive use of strong stimulants, trying to get that massive dopamine hit every time. Over time, it can deplete your readily releasable dopamine pool and lower your baseline motivation and energy. It can lead to burnout.
Like flooring the gas pedal constantly eventually wears out the engine or runs it out of fuel.
Good analogy. Sustainable energy and motivation often come from managing the baseline, not just chasing peaks.
You mentioned this idea of a dopamine set point being affected. Can you elaborate on that? How does pleasure-seeking change it?
Yeah, so the dopamine system evolved to drive seeking behavior, find food, water, mates, shelter. There's a natural cycle. Baseline dopamine drives seeking, finding the reward gives a peak, but then the baseline often drops below where it started for a bit.
Drops below even after something good, like winning a race.
Exactly. Think of marathon runners. They achieve this huge goal, you'd expect sustained elation, but often there's a post-race, low or blues. That's partly the dopamine baseline dipping after the peak.
And if you keep hitting the same pleasure button over and over,
the system adapts. That baseline can gradually adjust upwards. Your set point rises. This means you need a stronger stimulus, a bigger hit, to get the same feeling of pleasure or satisfaction you used to get from less. Things can lose their edge.
So chasing extreme highs makes normal pleasures feel dull.
That's the risk. Dr. Anna Lemke talks a lot about this in Dopamine Nation, this pleasure-pain balance. Every pleasure peak is followed by a pain trough, a dip below baseline experienced as craving.
And that dip is related to using up the available dopamine.
Partly, yes.
Yeah.
After a big release, those readily available dopamine stores in the neuron terminals, the vesicles, get depleted. It takes time to replenish them.
Which makes the link to addiction really clear. Chasing the high, but digging the hole deeper.
Precisely. Addiction is often that cycle. Pursuing huge peaks, leading to deeper and deeper baseline troughs, and mistakenly trying to fix the low baseline by chasing another peak, which just worsens the depletion.
Like in the video game example you mentioned, where eventually even the game isn't fun anymore.
Right. The world narrows, only the addictive behavior seems appealing, and then even that loses its reward value, leading to low motivation, low mood, potentially depression. But it doesn't have to be extreme addiction.
You mean like the work hard, play hard?
Yeah, constantly stacking dopamine hits throughout the week, maybe drinks after work, rich food, intense workouts, big social events. The cumulative effect of all those peaks and subsequent troughs can subtly lower your overall baseline over time, leading to feelings of burnout or just needing more stimulation to feel okay.
So understanding this peak baseline dance is key to making choices that keep our baseline healthy while still letting us enjoy life's pleasures.
That's the goal, finding that balance.
And you mentioned that giving the system a break, like that kid who quit screens for 30 days, can actually help reset things.
It really can. The dopamine system has a remarkable capacity for homeostasis, for rebalancing itself, if you reduce the intensity and frequency of the major dopamine spiking activities. Abstinence or significant reduction allows those depleted stores to replenish and the baseline to gradually recover.
So for healthier dopamine release, avoid the really big artificial spikes from drugs of abuse. What about everyday stuff?
Right. Things like chocolate in moderation, coffee, if you enjoy it responsibly, healthy consensual sex. These can be fine parts of life involving dopamine. But the real key for sustained motivation seems to be intermittent reinforcement.
Intermittent, meaning unpredictable rewards. Like gambling, but for life.
Kind of. Evolutionarily, we didn't get a reward every single time we hunted or foraged. Sometimes we succeeded, sometimes we didn't. That unpredictability keeps motivation high. The brain pays attention when rewards aren't guaranteed.
That's the reward prediction error thing. The surprise makes it stick.
Exactly. The difference between what you expect and what you get drives learning and future wanting. So you can leverage this.
How? Like deliberately make things less predictable?
In a way. Think about activities you want to be motivated for work, exercise, hobbies. Instead of always doing them the exact same way, with the exact same rewards or supports, introduce some variability.
Like with exercise, sometimes listen to music, sometimes don't. Sometimes use pre-workout, sometimes skip it.
Precisely. Avoid always layering every possible dopamine support onto the activity. If you always need music, A&D, caffeine and D, a specific environment to enjoy exercise, you're raising the bar for future enjoyment. Introduce intermittency.
Maybe flip a coin to decide if you get the extras today?
That's actually a great simple tool. It introduces that element of randomness that can help keep the dopamine system responsive and prevent the baseline from creeping too high.
Okay, that's practical. Now, what about the elephant in the room? Smartphones. Constantly feeding us information, notifications.
Yeah, smartphones are a major player here. They allow for constant dopamine layering. You're working, but also getting texts, social media updates, maybe listening to music, multiple streams of potential dopamine release happening almost constantly.
And that constant low-level drip or frequent small hits, that could be lowering our overall baseline or making us less sensitive, linked to maybe rising depression or lack of motivation.
It's a strong hypothesis, and the correlation is certainly there. That constant stimulation might prevent our baseline from ever fully resetting, making us feel subtly off or needing more and more input.
Like your experiment with removing the phone from workouts, made the workout itself more enjoyable again.
It did for me. Taking away the constant input of music or podcasts allowed the inherent satisfaction of the physical activity to come through more clearly. It suggests that sometimes subtracting stimuli can actually add to our fulfillment.
So maybe try doing activities you want to enjoy without the extra dopamine layer sometimes. Let the activity itself be the focus.
It's definitely worth experimenting with. See if removing those extra sources allows your baseline to recover and enhances your intrinsic enjoyment.
What about using stimulants specifically for work or study? Like not just coffee, but stronger things people might use off-label.
Generally, not a great idea for long-term motivation if it's not clinically prescribed for something like ADHD. Relying on stimulants every time you need to focus or perform can, again, undermine the intrinsic reward circuits associated with the task itself.
Even if it works in the short term.
Even then, you risk training your brain that the only way to engage in that activity is with the chemical boost, reducing your ability to find satisfaction or motivation in the task on its own later. Caffeine, as we said, might be a bit different due to the receptor upregulation, but stronger stuff.
Like those energy drinks packed with dopamine precursors.
Right, or non-prescription use of drugs like Adderall or modafinil. They can cause significant dopamine release that isn't tied to your actual effort or accomplishment, leading to potential depletion and motivation issues down the line. Intermittent use, if any, is far preferable to chronic reliance for simply getting through normal tasks.
Okay. You mentioned yerba mate earlier. Any other specific benefits there?
Well, besides the caffeine, antioxidants, and GLP-1, there's some emerging interesting research suggesting yerba mate might actually be neuroprotective for dopamine neurons.
Protecting the cells themselves, in both movement and motivation pathways.
That's what some early studies suggest. Still needs more research, but it's a promising angle beyond just being a caffeine source.
Good to know. Any dangerous interactions we should highlight again? Caffeine and MDMA?
Yes, that's worth reiterating, because caffeine can upregulate dopamine receptors. Mixing it with MDMA, which causes a massive dopamine and serotonin release, could potentially increase MDMA's neurotoxicity, a risky combination.
And the long-term impact of drugs like amphetamine or cocaine on brain structure.
Right, research shows they can limit brain plasticity, the ability to learn and adapt in key areas like the cortex and nucleus accumbens, even after stopping use. Those extreme dopamine fluctuations seem to have lasting negative effects on the brain's ability to rewire itself.
Really drives home the risks. Okay, let's shift fully positive. What about ways to get healthy, sustained dopamine increases? You mentioned cold exposure.
Yes. Deliberate cold exposure, cold showers, ice baths is a fascinating one. It's become popular, but there's real physiology behind it.
More than just waking you up.
Definitely. While adrenaline and noradrenaline shoot up fast when you hit the cold water, dopamine seems to rise more slowly, but stays elevated for much longer.
How long?
One study using water at about 14 Celsius, so moderately cold, found dopamine levels stayed elevated for up to 2.5 hours after the immersion.
2.5 hours of elevated dopamine from a cold shower, that's significant.
It is. There's a temporary cortisol spike too. It is stressful. But the sustained dopamine effect is quite remarkable. And interestingly, how you mentally cope with the cold, whether you try to relax, distract yourself, whatever, doesn't seem to change the dopamine outcome. The cold itself triggers it.
So regular, deliberate cold exposure could potentially lead to a nice sustained boost in mood, focus, alertness.
That's the potential benefit, yes. A way to leverage a brief, uncomfortable stimulus for a prolonged neurochemical advantage.
Okay, another big one you touched on was harnessing effort itself. Not just the reward after effort, but the effort during.
This is huge for long-term motivation. Relying only on rewards after hard work can make the work itself feel longer and less rewarding. It separates the effort from the dopamine release.
So the goal is to link the dopamine to the struggle. How?
By adopting that growth mindset, consciously telling yourself, this friction, this challenge, this is good, I chose this is making me better. Even if it feels hard, you mentally reframe the effort itself as the rewarding part.
Like David Goggins, embracing the suck.
He's an extreme example, but yes, that's the principle. Learning to access dopamine release from the effort. The key is, don't spike dopamine right before with stimulants. Don't only focus on the reward after, but learn to attach the dopamine release to the process of striving.
That feels like a skill you'd have to practice.
It absolutely is. It's rewiring that association.
You mentioned intermittent fasting fits here too, linking reward to deprivation.
Right. The effort is the fasting period. Then, when you eat, the food is more rewarding, partly because your receptors are more sensitive, but also because your brain associates the reward with the preceding effort of abstaining.
And knowing the health benefits helps too.
Yes, cognitive framing matters. Believing the fasting is good for you reinforces the dopamine release associated with the whole process, the deprivation, and the eventual eating. We even saw that just hearing information validating your beliefs can trigger dopamine. Our thoughts really shape this system.
What about the opposite, constant indulgence, like with sugar or super tasty foods?
That can definitely blunt the system. Eating highly palatable, sugary foods all the time can make normal, healthy foods seem less appealing because your dopamine response gets conditioned to expect that high intensity.
But you can reset that relatively quickly.
Seems so. Even just a couple of days, maybe 48 hours, of avoiding those hyper-palatable foods can start to resensitize your taste buds and dopamine circuits, making simpler foods taste better again.
Moderation and occasional resets seem key. What about something like pornography, given its intensity and accessibility?
Similar principle applies. The high intensity and novelty readily available in pornography can potentially raise the dopamine threshold required for arousal and satisfaction in real-life sexual encounters, making them seem less stimulating by comparison.
Okay, quickly touching on a few other tools or substances. Well, Butrin.
Prescription antidepressant, bupropion, boosts norepinephrine and dopamine. Can help with motivation, mood, sometimes fewer side effects than SSRIs, but can also cause anxiety, suppress appetite. Needs a doctor's guidance, obviously.
Mucuna pruriens, the L-dopa source.
A natural source of L-dopa, dopamine's precursor. Used sometimes for Parkinson's, might affect prolactin, maybe sperm quality. Big caution, though. Taking L-duo directly can cause big dopamine fluctuations and crashes. Not something to casually experiment with.
L-tyrosine, another precursor.
Yes, an amino acid precursor. Can give a noticeable energy focus boost fairly quickly, maybe 30-45 minutes. Studies confirm it raises dopamine. But again, it's usually short-lived, maybe 30 minutes of increased levels, likely followed by a dip below baseline. Less risky than L-duopia, perhaps, but still, regular use isn't ideal due to that potential dip in reliance.
And things to avoid for dopamine: melatonin supplements, late-night light.
Yeah, some research suggests melatonin pills might decrease dopamine shortly after taking them. And we know bright light exposure late at night, especially 10 p.m. to 4 a.m., definitely suppresses dopamine levels for potentially days afterwards. So dim lights in the evening, avoid screens before bed, maybe skip the melatonin unless truly needed good dopamine hygiene.
What about PEA, alpha-GPC, huperzine A? Those sometimes pop up in nootropic stacks.
PEA is in chocolate, naturally boosts dopamine. Alpha-GPC and huperzine A work more on the acetylcholine system, which interacts with dopamine, so potential indirect effects. But like with many supplements, the effects can be subtle or vary a lot, and caution is needed. Don't just mix things without understanding them.
Okay. We've covered chemicals, behaviors, mindset, but what about just people? Social connection.
Hugely important. And there's direct biology here. Research, like from Rob Malenka's lab, shows that oxytocin released during bonding, close friendships, romantic connection, parent-child interactions directly stimulates dopamine release in those reward pathways.
So connecting with people literally triggers our reward system.
It does. Makes perfect evolutionary sense. Seeking connection is vital for survival. So the simple, powerful message is cultivate quality, healthy social interactions. It's fundamental for your dopamine levels and well-being.
It really all ties together. Anything else, maybe indirect effects, like gut health?
Yeah, there are indirect factors too. Things like improving gut microbiome health can influence the overall environment dopamine works in. Or supplements like maca might help by reducing cortisol, which indirectly supports dopamine. These are usually more subtle modulating effects rather than direct dopamine spikes.
Okay, so wrapping this all up. Despite the complexity, the big message seems to be one of empowerment. We have more control than we think.
I truly believe so. Understanding how your past dopamine shapes your present and how your current choices shape your future dopamine landscape, that gives you agency. By using the tools, behavioral changes, mindset shifts, maybe careful use of supplements or meds under guidance, you really can learn to modulate this system for your own benefit, for better focus, motivation, and enjoyment of life.
Wow. This has been incredibly eye-opening, way beyond just hits. So to recap the big ideas, dopamine is complex, baseline and peaks interact, tons of things affect it, and crucially, how we approach effort and engage mentally really matters.
Absolutely. We hope listeners take some time to think about how this applies to their lives, maybe notice their own patterns. Feel free to revisit parts of this discussion or check out resources like Dr. Lemke's book, or even dive into some of the research papers if you're really curious.
And maybe a final thought to chew on. Now that you understand this currency of motivation a bit better, how are you going to invest yours? Or maybe pick one thing you do for that quick hit. Could be scrolling, could be food, whatever, and think, could I introduce some unpredictability? Could I focus more on the process, less on just the outcome? Something to ponder. Thanks so much for joining us on this deep dive into dopamine.